Taehyung. The bell announcing the arrival of the lift rings through the flat, and Mrs. Kim stops typing on her laptop for a moment, but the next second she's back to it. Taehyung enters the flat, striding loud and fast, and freezes when he finds himself in the large room where his wife is sitting on the sofa. He places the bags with the food he brought on the large dining table and looks around the room nervously. "Where's Jun-cook?" "Yes, darling. Hello. My day is great. How's yours?" Without taking her eyes off the laptop, the woman coos with a smile. "Mrs. Kim, where is he?" "What? You don't even say hello to your lovely wife." "Mrs. Kim, where is he?" "Where's Jun-cook?" Taehyung says, looking at her from under his eyebrows, and Mrs. Kim sighs, pulling the laptop off her lap, rising to her feet and shaking her head. "Honey, you know I don't like it when you act so rude." She moves closer, kissing him discreetly on the cheek, and Taehyung exhales noisily. "Okay," he nods, clenching his jaw and looking at his wife. "Yeah, okay. You're not going to tell me?" "I'll figure this out myself." The man takes off his coat, tosses it on the chair, and strides towards the bedroom. "Mr. Kim." Taehyung. Mrs. Kim's steely voice breaks the silence, broken only by his footsteps, and makes the man freeze. Taehyung feels it in the back of his head as she stands in the same spot, her eyes scanning him. And then, playing with his cheekbones, he lets out a loud breath and turns to look at his wife with expectation. "First of all, if you think that your screaming and psychotics will have a good effect on the sick and sleeping Jun-cook, then you will get the hell out of this apartment right now. This is my apartment." "I didn't finish." He shuts up, raising his hands under his eyebrows in displeasure, looking away. The woman shakes her head with a condescending smile, and then approaches her husband again, touching his tense shoulders, and begins to gently rub them, looking into the man's eyes. "Have you calmed down?" He nods reluctantly. "Breathe out, and better set the table. You don't want us to eat out of plastic containers from the restaurant, do you? So please take care of this and organize our dinner. In the meantime, I'll wake Jun-cook up and help him get dressed." Taehyung turns his gaze to her as soon as he hears the boy's name. "So maybe it's better if I told you to set the table." Taehyung lets out another noisy exhale, filled with a sense of hopelessness. The man closes his eyes, breathing deeply, and then looks again into his wife's brown eyes. "Is he okay?" he asks with just his lips. And Mrs. Kim barely nods at him with a shadow of a smile at the corners of her lips. "Okay. Fine," he gives up very quietly. "I'll set the table, thank you." Mrs. Kim nods again, lifts herself up on the toes of her shoes just a little, and leaves another discreet kiss on his cheek. "We'll be ready in 10 minutes. Taehyung takes another deep breath but still can't help but click his tongue, and then he walks past his wife, picking up the delivered packages along the way, and still heads for the kitchen. And the woman, watching him until he disappears into another room, smiles and goes to the bedroom. Slipping behind the door, she immediately closes it behind her and quietly approaches the bed, where Jun-cook has dozed off again. "Jun-cook, dear," Mrs. Kim softly calls out, sitting on the edge of the bed and stroking his head. "Darling, wake up. Come on, it's time for lunch." He frowns, emerging from his shallow sleep, disrupted by the high temperature of his body, and yawns as he sits up. "Mrs. Kim," he calls out in a hoarse voice, rubbing his eyes. "Lunch? Has Mr. Kim arrived?" "Yes, dear. So get up and wash your face. I'll help you change." But my clothes." He looks around in confusion. "Mr. Kim. He put them somewhere. I don't know where they are," he says, then looks at the woman again. Could you find them? Please, I'll prepare everything for you. Mrs. Kim nods with a mysterious smile, then adjusts his tousled hair. Go wash up. I'll wait for you here. Jun-cook nods as he gets out of bed, wincing from the discomfort in his sore throat. He shuffles towards the bathroom, yawning again, and tries to ignore the heaviness in his head as he disappears behind the door. Approaching the sink, Jun-cook touches a sensor button on the mirror, turning on the light, and is horrified by his own reflection. There are beads of sweat on his forehead, and he has small reddish bruises under his eyes, stark against his pale, sickly skin. He quickly rinses his face and then picks up the brush, which Mr. Kim kindly provided him with yesterday, standing alone in a glass next to the man's electric toothbrush, and starts brushing his teeth quickly. Standing on his feet is somewhat challenging because the heavy head sends a strange weakness throughout his whole body, and at one point, Jun-cook has to lean on the sink to avoid falling. Unpleasant chills run through his bare knees, and Jun-cook shivers, always in its own way, frightening him. So, having finished all the procedures quickly, he dries his face with a soft terry cloth towel and then, breathing harshly through his mouth because his nose is still congested, he returns to the room. There, Mrs. Kim has already straightened the blanket and is sorting out some items on the bed. Mrs. Kim, I'm done, he says softly, and the woman immediately turns to him with a smile, extending her hand. Great. Come here. Jun-cook is so weak and unwilling to argue with her that he simply takes her outstretched hand, helping him get to the bed, and frowns a little, not even realizing at first if he might be hallucinating from the heat. Mrs. Kim. What is this? She chuckles softly, fixing his hair again, and then starts carefully unbuttoning that belongs to her husband but is currently worn by the boy. Well, you're not going to the table in just a shirt, are you? And Taehyung threw away your old clothes, so I bought new ones for you. What? Jun-cook exclaims in indignation, regretting it immediately as he winces from the pain in his throat and head. You threw it away? Who allowed him to throw away my clothes? Jun-cook. Mrs. Kim. This is not right. This is not right. Those were my clothes. Why did he? Jun-cook. Her voice becomes firmer, and the boy falls silent. You remember what we talked about today, don't you? You will accept his care, but throwing away someone else's belongings is not care, this is care. Well, in my husband's Kim, she chuckles, finally finishing with the buttons and carefully takes off his shirt, leaving Jun-cook standing in jeans and socks in front of her. Taehyung said he doesn't like what you wear because those clothes are old and dirty. He doesn't want you to wear that. He doesn't get to decide what I wear. Jun-cook rumbles in annoyance, shivering from the cold as the woman turns to the bed to grab something. And my clothes are perfectly fine. Maybe Mr. Kim doesn't like them, but I choose what I wear, maybe. But for now, our agreement is still in effect, Jun-cook, and you'll accept even this kind of care from him. The woman continues confidently and calmly, turning back and nodding for Jun-cook to raise his arms, suddenly putting on him a crisp white t-shirt. I'd also spent my time selecting and buying this for you. So please, show some respect. At least for me. He gives in, biting his tongue, and only a noisy exhale betrays his displeasure. Do you remember everything I told you? About your behavior? Yes, Mrs. Kim. Try not to argue with him. At least not unnecessarily. Accept his help. She retrieves something else from the bed, and suddenly, Jun-cook finds himself holding soft, baby blue sweatpants. Blue. He arches an eyebrow in disbelief, looking at Mrs. Kim. She nods. Blue. Put them on before you freeze. Jungkook sighs again but puts on the sweatpants. How soft, a thought crosses his mind. Soft and warm, with a gentle lining inside, pleasantly enveloping his skinny legs. Good. Now this, she hands him a large hoodie in the same color, and Jungkook immediately puts it on. The hood settles nicely on his head, slightly off-center. Mrs. Kim adjusts it for him and then, frowning, touches his forehead. What's wrong? She asks with a deeper voice, making him sound much lower and gruffer than usual, and Mrs. Kim sighs. Your forehead is very hot. Sit down for a minute. Jungkook complies, wearily sinking onto the edge of the bed, and the woman retrieves the thermometer, which her guard had purchased along with the medications, and immediately places it in Jungkook's mouth. Jungkook sighs, patiently waiting for the results, and he doesn't even protest when Mrs. Kim adjusts his fringe and strokes his head through the hood. Then, the thermometer beeps, and Mrs. Kim immediately retrieves it to check the result. This won't do, she sighs, putting it back in its case and returning to Jungkook. Your temperature has gone up even more. We'll have lunch now, and then you'll take your medicines again. And you'll get back to bed. Jungkook wearily smiles, looking up at her. But what if Mr. Kim wants to take care of me and do something with me? Should I behave even if Mr. Kim wants something? He will have to wait for you to get better, she replies coldly. Jungkook wearily laughs, not holding back, and the woman shakes her head. All right, let's go. You need to eat. Taehyung has probably already set the table. Jungkook gets up, following the woman to the exit, and raises an eyebrow. Mr. Kim sets the table himself? So he's, like, a normal person? Like everyone else. Jungkook. What? She doesn't respond, leaving the bedroom first, and Jungkook lags behind, unable to walk as fast because he's still weak, and everything is spinning, pulsating, and floating before his eyes. And when Mrs. Kim enters the dining room, Jungkook freezes in the doorway as soon as he sees Mr. Kim arranging something on the table. Every time he sees this man, something inside him starts to beat anxiously, and he can't do anything about it. It takes just a moment for Taehyung, noticing his wife's return, to lift his gaze, hoping to see Jungkook somewhere nearby. And as soon as he spots the boy standing at the entrance to the room, a napkin holder slips from his hands, making a thud as it lands on the wooden table. Taehyung, his wife sighs under her breath, shaking her head in disappointment, but the man, brushing it off, can't take his eyes off Jungkook. This tiny Jungkook, who he had in his bed just half a day ago, but it feels like an eternity. And now he stands right here in this new baby blue tracksuit that looks so soft and cozy on him, pulling up the sleeves on his small fists. The wide hood hides his slightly disheveled hair. But all this coziness contrasts so sharply with his pale face and the bruises on his cheek, making his appearance so painful. In the next second, as Jungkook takes another hesitant step, Taehyung doesn't even realize that he's now standing next to him, supporting him by his elbow. Jungkook. Baby, how do you feel? Something hurts, sweetheart, he immediately starts asking, leading him to the table, and Jungkook is overwhelmed by this unexpected attention that has suddenly come his way. The hell is going on? Mrs. Kim shakes her head. Pitiful. Her husband is awfully pitiful in his obsession. But she suppresses a laugh. Darling, please control yourself. At least in front of me, she comments with restraint. Taehyung just waves it off, paying no attention, and doesn't take his eyes off Jun-cook, pulling a chair out for him and helping him sit. Does it hurt, baby boy? He sits down in front of him on his haunches, touching covered in the soft fabric, and Jun-cook looks at him with fear, afraid to say anything. Baby? What's wrong? It's just a cold, Mr. Kim, Jun-cook mumbles hoarsely. Nothing serious, really. I'll get better in a couple of days. Taehyung, sit at the table, for God's sake. Mrs. Kim sits down with a sigh, and just as Taehyung is about to protest, she speaks again. Taehyung, sit down. Let's start our dinner, he sighs, getting to his feet, and grabs a neighboring chair, placing it right next to Jun-cook, and then takes a seat next to him. Mr. Kim. Jun-cook hesitantly calls, looking at him with a slight fear and suspicion. Don't you think you're too close, sir? What? No. No, I'll sit next to you to help you. I can hold a spoon, sir. Don't argue with me. But Jun-cook suddenly locks eyes with Mrs. Kim, noticing a hint in her expression, and falls silent. Yes, sir. Just, could you move back a bit, please? I don't want to accidentally elbow you while eating. Mrs. Kim can't help but let out a quiet chuckle upon hearing Jun-cook's response, and she lifts a glass of wine to her lips, taking a sip. Taehyung freezes, not expecting to hear agreement, and then obediently moves his chair. Well, if those couple of inches will make any difference at all. I brought you some soup. With vegetables and turkey, the man starts explaining with a smile, taking care of the boy, and pushes the plate closer to Jun-cook. It was warm when I brought it, but I still heated it up a bit. Of course, I didn't make it too hot because I'm not sure if it's safe for you, but if you need, I can heat it up more, he mutters, wiping a spoon for Jun-cook with an already quite clean cloth, and then hands it to the boy. Come on, what are you waiting for? Eat, please. Jun-cook looks at him with the same mix of fear and suspicion, never having seen this side of Mr. Kim before, and takes the spoon, hesitantly dipping it into the soup. Thank you, he quickly nods. Are you not going to eat, Mr. Kim? I will. Taehyung nods with a smile, not taking his eyes off Jun-cook. But I want you to eat first. Come on, baby boy, enjoy your meal. Sir, Jun-cook says, and he wishes he could disappear into the ground under Taehyung's intense green gaze. Then he looks at Mrs. Kim, feeling a bit nervous. Mrs. Kim, boss Jun-cook. She nods with a smile, but her eyes show a slight disappointment when she turns her gaze back to Taehyung. Dear, don't drool over him, for God's sake. You're not a dog. Mrs. Kim, Taehyung retorts with faint annoyance, as if saying, please, stop talking, and Mrs. Kim chuckles quietly, starting her meal. Pathetic. How pathetic he is, Mrs. Kim thinks. It's an incredible spectacle. She hasn't had this much fun in a long time.